Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you who have joined us. We'll take just a second more, maybe one more minute to let people join, and then we'll get started with our webinar today. And just for some context setting, think of this more as a conversation. We were not going to be using a lot of slides, so you're more likely to see more of Aaron and myself speaking than a whole lot of slide content. That being said, we really invite a lot of questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat as we go. So if there's something that we mention that perks your curiosity, or maybe you have an answer that we don't, please put it in the chat and I'll do my best to address it. Let me just check. Pardon me. Whew. Yeah, we're getting some good traction here, and a really global audience looking at the names here. So thanks so much for joining. Very excited. All right, well, let's get started. First, welcome to this webinar. It is really meant to be an introductory conversation about how real-world evidence and real-world data fit into more traditional, what I call randomized clinical trials, or RCTs. And we focused this in on basics and considerations. So I'm going to get to an introduction of myself and Aaron in just a second, but I first want to say thank you very much to Sean and Becca, who helped us coordinate this. This session is being recorded and will be made available to anyone who registered for it. I bet it will be available on the Curebase website as well. And at the end of this literally 3-slide deck, you'll have a way to reach out to me if you have any additional questions. So I'll start with a quick introduction. My name is Jane Myles. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Trial Innovation at Curebase. Curebase is a DCT platform and services organization with the mission of making trials more accessible to patients anywhere they are in ways that meet all of our regulatory and compliance requirements. I joined Curebase in late August, having spent literally a lifetime working in clinical operations at various sponsor companies. Spent a lot of time working at Genentech and Roche, running global trials. Most recently, I was at LabCorp building the DCT Center of Excellence on how exactly we scale and operationalize these trials globally. While I was at Genentech, sometime more than a decade ago now, believe it or not, I got the opportunity to meet and work with Aaron and some other leaders in the field of real-world data who had this dream. Way back then, it was called E2BI, which I think was electronic evidence.
It was external electronic biomedical information.
There you go.
Real world data flows a little better than that, but that was our attempt.
Yeah, so Aaron, why don't you take up that thread and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So again, nice to meet everyone and be here. Aaron Kamauu. I'm a physician, and while I was in medical school, I trained in both public health and medical informatics for completely different reasons. Public health a little bit because of my interest in underserved patient populations, having a native Hawaiian background, and medical informatics because just computer science was fascinating to me. And I thought I would be a practicing clinician in radiology that might dabble a bit in public health and informatics. And by the time I was in my first year of residency, I realized how much more passionate I was about the medical informatics and technology around healthcare. And so I left my clinical path and took that leap over into a career in the electronic health record space. As a young informaticist, in 2006, I thought that was the future career path for me, and kind of anticipated, as much of us have seen over the last 15 years, this increase in adoption and complexity around these electronic health record systems. And so I managed a content engineering team at a small up and coming specialty specific EMR company. And during that time, I was recruited to Roche. And this was just before the Roche and Genentech merger, less than a year, I think, before, by a upperclassman mentor of mine from back in school. And frankly, so I don't know that you even know this, Jane, but I took the interview as a courtesy. Like I didn't think anything about pharma, biotech, research. I thought I was an EHR career path, and came out to the Roche Palo Alto office and was just fascinated by this entire world, as now all of us in this audience are familiar with, around clinical research and how important it is to the kind of research we do to bring medical advances to patients who need them. And also, as you mentioned, starting to have a little bit of that vision of, whoa, what could we do if we could access existing healthcare data in a more meaningful way, especially compared to 13, 14 years ago now when I started. And so I was given a lot of opportunity within Roche to go out and explore and learn the drug development and access and medical affairs type of activities, and then to kind of propose ideas in which we might be able to leverage real world data, before we called it real world data, to support those kinds of activities. I wasn't the first one coming up with the ideas by any means. There were others who were blazing trails before me that I was able to take some of those ideas and reach out to people like you. And as you already indicated, you had been working in those clinical trial operations activities, and you knew that extremely well. I was understanding how healthcare data and EHR data and claims data were acquired, and trying to see how we could marry those two together. And frankly, I think that kind of falls into, of course, the topic here of saying, how might we leverage external healthcare data or real world data and real world evidence to support our drug development activities, specifically within the context of clinical trials. And long story short, I've spent the last 14 years focused on this, from Roche and Genentech days to some entrepreneurship and startup company work that I did for about 6.5 years, and then acquired by a large CRO. And I've been an advisor and a consultant in the space for the last couple of years now. I think you're.
I am muted. It's a great story of focusing, being curious and focusing, and kind of exploring your passion while you're driving understanding and change. And that's kind of what we're going to do here. But it's going to be not at Aaron's deep technical knowledge level of expertise. We're going to start with me as a novice. Like, I am an operator. I understand how you build and run trials. I'm curious to know how real world data can help, and what we need to think about as we start to build trials that might encompass real world data elements along with randomized clinical trial or RCT methods.
Great question. So I'll approach this a little bit from a historical perspective. When you and I were working together 13, 12 years ago on this space, I think what seemed obvious to us was starting with the idea around how to use data, real world data, to support clinical operations activities. For some people out there who might be familiar with this, there were papers coming out, like a seminal paper from Tufts University that talked about the cost and complexity of operational activities around running clinical trials, and things like enrollment rates and challenges meeting target enrollment timelines and those kinds of operational activities. And so I think we, as an industry as a whole, really focused a lot on that about 10 years ago to figure out how might we leverage data to support it. Frankly, I think we're still working on how we can have very meaningful solutions that can be consistent, meaningful solutions using real data there. But there's been a lot of advances in that space. And then over the years, we've started to kind of allow our minds to think beyond that and to say, well, how about when we're running a clinical trial and we're randomizing patients and we're collecting data, can we reduce the burden on patients and reduce the burden on sites by collecting some of that data in a supplementary way? And so some have called those hybrid studies, some have called those EHR enhanced study designs. The idea is still being a normal, relatively normal, let's say, randomized clinical trial, site-based trial approach, but trying to supplement some of the data collection and take some of that burden off the patients and sites. And then you can kind of see somewhat of a progression from there over the last 5 years in particular, where we started to ask ourselves, well, could we replace a control arm or supplement an entire control arm with real world data if that control arm is basically looking at patients under standard of care? And what are the challenges there? Could we use real world data in combination with decentralized clinical trial activities to reduce burden on sites and go direct to patients and do direct with patient engagements? And frankly, a lot of these kinds of ideas around EHR enhanced studies, external control arms, the merging of real world data with decentralized clinical trial solutions are still really novel today. And there are examples of some of these studies, but it's certainly not a solved science yet. And I think that that's kind of that evolution, clinical trial operations activities into then data collection and even adjusting the way in which we actually conduct the trials themselves.
Becca, could you advance the slide just so that we can clarify to people, here's what we're going to talk about. And Aaron's already got us started. We also got a great question in the chat, which is, how are you going to address real world evidence in this discussion, since that was in our title? So maybe we should actually start with that. What is the difference between real world data and real world evidence? We've talked a tiny bit about why sponsors are combining, but then let's talk about how real world data / real world evidence is different from randomized clinical trial data and what you need to think about.
That's a great question. So I think in this field broadly, when we talk about real world data, real world evidence, frankly, I think it's similar to our sister decentralized clinical trial partners, if you will, in the field. A lot, I think, is very dependent on definitions and what do we exactly mean by that. And so in parallel, I am just pulling up the FDA. So in December 2018, the FDA released a framework for their RWE, a real world evidence program. And in that document, as well as a few other guidance documents, they give us their definition of what real world data and real world evidence is. And I'd like to kind of start there because it gives us a trusted, let's say trusted, meaningful entity and stakeholder in the market around what their definition is. But I'd like to propose a broader definition from that. And so just reading from that document real quick, the FDA defines real world data as data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. So they keep the variety of sources thing broad, but they are kind of really focused on health delivery of healthcare and health status data routinely collected, which I think is very US centric and kind of focuses on the fact that many of us in the US have our healthcare done through these healthcare provider system engagements. But I would actually propose a broader definition of real world data. For me, real world data is related to the person's health status and any care we receive that is in the real world setting versus a clinical trial controlled setting. And I mean by that is, I think as we continue to broaden our ideas and as kind of technology continues to advance, the way we manage our exercise routines, the way we manage our diets, the way we manage our mindfulness and meditations or calm or all of these asleep, these aren't really things that we engage our healthcare providers for. And yet all of that information is relevant to health status, well-being, the kind of care we receive to drive our health status in a certain direction. I think all of that over time in the future will become more and more relevant to the kind of research we do. And then therefore, if I think about real world evidence, the FDA defines it as clinical evidence about the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product, and it's the evidence derived from analysis of real world data. So according to the FDA, then, whenever we use real world data to derive evidence around the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product, that's real world evidence. And again, from the context of the FDA, that's a very appropriate definition because their mindset is approval of medical advances and medical products. I would argue a much broader definition in other use cases as well, which can be, to me, it's like a little equation here. Anytime we do the appropriate analysis of reliable real world data, we can generate meaningful real world evidence. And we might use that real world evidence for a lot of different things. It could be for registration and approval purposes. It could be discussions with payers, evidence for providers and for patients. It could be internal decision-making. It could be supporting clinical trial operations activities or reducing burden in some of our trial designs. So to me, again, I kind of take that broader definition. And when you as an audience hear me refer to real world data and real world evidence, I'm thinking of real world data as anything related to a person's health status and well-being and the health care that we receive to pursue, to manage that. And when I say real world evidence, I'm really referring to any appropriate analysis on that data that can generate evidence that we might use for a variety of purposes.
Okay, I'm going to play with that analogy for a second. Then we're going to go back to randomized clinical trials. Because if those of you who don't know me probably don't know that I'm a wearables nerd. I'm a nerd in a lot of ways, but I'm literally wearing 3 wearables right now. One of them is the Oura Ring, which you might see here. So the real world data that it collects is around my activity levels, my sleep, my mood, my feelings of well-being, right? So I get to put data into an app about all of that. The real world evidence generated from that data, I'm making this up now, could be whether or not I have better overall well-being, and if I was using mental health services, if those decreased because of the interventions I was taking based on the data from the ring. Is that a reasonable analogy, Aaron?
Yeah, that's great. And by the way, I'm an equal nerd with you. So I have my Oura Ring. I actually wear a continuous glucose monitor, even though I don't have diabetes. And granted, I'm not actually implying that it's significantly impacting my health status yet, but to your point, kind of how we collect the data. So from an individual perspective, yes, you're using my definitions correctly. But now I think more often we're going to say now at an aggregate level, if we look at aggregate data from these different devices in connection with electronic health records or claims or some of these patient registry data, some of these other data sources we're a little more familiar with, to me, that continues to be a collection of real world data.
I gotcha. So not a perfect example, definitely not a randomized clinical trial example. In fact, my behavior with the Oura Ring and even my baseline watch are indicative of some of the challenges I think we might face with randomized clinical trials integrating real world data, not yet generating real world evidence. But I don't always wear the ring. I don't always do my ECG. And I'm a very non-compliant healthcare participant in the US medical system. So how do you need to think about those situations like missing data or defining the right data source when you are aiming to replace or add to the randomized clinical trial data that you're already planning to collect?
That's a great question. So I think what you're touching on is exactly one of the core differences between real world kind of data or real world setting and our clinical trial settings. In our clinical trial settings, we have a very controlled, let's say controlled environment. We're very specified in terms of what data is collected, how frequent. We have mechanisms built in there to avoid missiness, as you already alluded to, or some level of messiness of data. And yet in the real world setting, we certainly do have a lot of that kind of messiness that it's funny. I was actually on a Clubhouse discussion a couple of months ago where someone had mentioned, well, real world data, EHR data is very messy. And someone from the EHR space actually came in a little bit in defense of that, saying, well, I think healthcare is messy and the data accurately reflects the messiness of healthcare. And you're kind of touching on that piece of it. I don't always go in for my annual asthma checkups on perfect timing anyways. It might be 14, 15 months, it might be 11 months, right? And that's just normal life. We're not always perfectly regimented. And therefore the data will certainly reflect that variability in just how people engage and manage their healthcare, whether it's through sensors and devices or engagements with their healthcare providers. That said, I also do think that there is a messiness of translation from what happened into the data itself. So we're kind of compounding a little bit, and those are challenges we have to manage, certainly when we're leveraging that data. I would say that there are a number of limitations. Messiness is one of them. And more often than not, we're not able to necessarily correct for those limitations as much as more often we're acknowledging the limitation, and to the extent that we can, acknowledging the impact of those limitations. Is there bias that's introduced because of it? Is there confounding that it might be there because of those limitations that wouldn't have been there otherwise? And therefore, how do we account for those limitations downstream, whether in analyses or maybe all the way down to interpretation, where we say, here's the results of the data, but we have to take the interpretation a little bit differently because we know there were certain limitations in the data. And frankly, one last point is sometimes real world data is not the solution to answer some questions. It's just simply not the right source. And so to me, it's a tool of many toolkits, tools in a toolkit. And in some cases, it's a great fit. And in some cases, it's not the right fit.
I have a couple of follow-up questions, including one from the chat. Let's go backwards to Matt's question for a sec. What's the difference between real-world evidence and observational data? Because it's a great one. And then I've got some follow-on questions about what would you need to do if you were planning to use RWD in an RCT? Whew.
Yeah, perfect. So firstly, Matthew, great question. In fact, actually around I want to say it's around 2015 time period, maybe 2016 when I had first, maybe a little earlier, but when I had first really heard the term real world data, somewhere in that time period, 2013 to 2016, I can't remember exactly. And I had the exact same question. I was like, wait, we've been talking about observational data, especially within the pharmacoepi perspective and HEOR perspective. And frankly, I actually think what's happened is we've taken that term of observational data and expanded the definition and now gave it a new term. Because I personally, having worked in this now for 14 years, I don't distinguish a significant difference. If anything, we've taken the expansion of that where, again, 13, 14 years ago, running, let's say, fairly traditional pharmacoepi and HEOR type of studies using existing observational data sources, we were definitely quite limited in terms of the kind of data accessible to us. And today that's expanded a lot. And so I think really it's a transition of terms and not necessarily that they're distinctive from each other.
Most of the trials I did in my distant past that were observational were more in the post-marketing / phase 4 space, right? Used to be.
Yeah. So a lot of, in fact, even that has now shifted a lot where there are departments that have traditionally run observational research studies in that post-approval state, sometimes associated with post-approval safety studies, sometimes for observation, long-term observation and so forth. And now they're transitioning, now they're calling themselves real-world evidence studies, even though they're effectively the same kind of studies. Yeah.
So, for example, in my past, one of those studies might have been to determine the long-term efficacy of a new treatment and whether or not new safety signals arose. But it was meant to follow the patient's course of treatment in a real-world setting under the auspices of an observational trial. Does that make sense?
That's right. So I think that that's part of the expansion, where I think we had a more narrow focus on some of the use cases and studies we were doing there. And now that has expanded a little bit. We have this umbrella term of real world evidence. using real world data. The data might come from existing data sources, or we might go out and prospectively and proactively create and collect the data in an observation and real world setting with minimal to no intervention on the patient. And now we've kind of expanded the questions we're asking from long-term safety to even longer-term effectiveness. In fact, there's no better example than right now with COVID and how so many vaccines and treatments have come to market in a very quick way under emergency use authorization. And a lot of the evidence is now really real world and observational and non-interventional, but they're still core to a lot of the learnings that we're capturing around it. And I noticed, Matthew, you added a comment in the chat just to clarify synthetic control arms, and we should come back to that, or external control arms, as I generally call them, are a subset of a type of use of real world data within the context of randomized interventional clinical trials, generally speaking. Not necessarily what we're talking about in terms of observational research, prospective studies.
I think of it very simplistically, like my dream is that if, let's say you're working on a lung cancer treatment, if there's data that already exists for patients that had that particular subtype of lung cancer, and you could use it as a way to match patients who are going to get the new investigational treatment, that to me is the ultimate synthetic control arm situation.
Yeah, no, great point. So I actually have, I actually do workshops on this. I conducted a real world data based external or synthetic control arm. In fact, the fact that we haven't normalized to a term here yet is still something of a demonstration of the novelty of it. But we, and so to your point, there's kind of a spectrum of the way in which we might think of comparison analyses in terms of we can do it at a cohort level and look at existing data sources, and here's a cohort of patients treated, here's untreated, and we've been doing those kinds of HEOR type comparative outcomes analyses for many years. I think you're really touching on the key distinction of what we really mean when most of us, at least when we say external synthetic control arm. And what we mean by that is can we supplement or take a traditionally randomized clinical trial where you would normally randomize patients onto treatment or not, then the control could be an active control or a placebo control, standard of care control, et cetera, whatever that control is defined as. Can we either replace that entire control arm using existing real world data or supplement and reduce that? I've seen some study designs where it's like almost like a double randomization, randomize people to treatment or control. And then of those on the control arm, half of them get randomized into data only, and the other half stay in as a traditional control. So you're reducing, again, burden on sites, burden on patients. There's a lot of, it gets pretty technical, and there's a lot of rigor that would go into ensuring that the existing real world data is sufficient and reliable to be used as a comparator in those situations. But where there is a fit, it can serve as that kind of solution.
I think you're out at the bleeding edge of innovation right now. Like, that is not a norm. It's not even what we aimed to talk about when we started talking about how
Right.
do you include real world data in a randomized clinical trial. But I think we're going that way. And I know that regulators and cross-industry forums like Transcelerate are really trying to help us understand what it takes and drive that new set of design and implementation methodologies. I want to go back to the more basic RCT. So
Sure.
Let's imagine you did want to add real world data as a supplement, not as a full control arm necessarily. When do you start that conversation, and who's involved? Specifically, when would you need to engage with regulators if you wanted to use this in a registrational setting? And how the heck do you engage your biostatistician to help you determine whether or not you can accept that data messiness?
Yeah, great questions. And so let me take a little step back and just say, depending on our use case, what we're using that real world data for and who we're submitting it to, let's say like that purpose, and so who's the audience and what's the purpose of using that data, we might think of it on two scales of rigor, kind of a scientific rigor scale, and we have a kind of informatics or data science rigor scale. And the reason I bring that up is we sometimes, without really knowing it, we sometimes play with the levels on the scale depending on what we're using for. So for example, if we're using the data to help us identify potential sites or potential patients and reach out to those patients and support patient recruitment activities, oftentimes those activities are very early in the process, and those patients will still go through traditional pre-screening and screening activities. And because that happens before the patients enroll, we can adjust how rigorous we are in identifying those patients depending on how hard it is to find the patients. And so we might throw out a very broad net and keep our kind of parameters simple and broadly defined if it's a very rare condition and we're just trying to find anyone who might be eligible. Or we might tighten it up if it's not quite as rare and we want to be more precise at who we find in terms of increasing the likelihood that they're eligible for the study. And the impact is all clinical trial operations. It's like we might have higher or lower screen fails. We might have, higher or lower enrollment rates down the road from that. And we can kind of consider that. But because the data itself is not being submitted to another stakeholder, it's not being submitted to the FDA or so forth, just the trial data is going to be submitted downstream, then we're not as concerned about some of the questions you just brought up. But when we start to come into the idea of saying we're collecting data, supplementary data, let's say, for the patient populations in the trial, and that data is intended to be submitted to the FDA or to a regulatory agency, then absolutely those questions become essential. And I always advise, I should say, I was going to say argue, but really advise that to engage those stakeholders early and often. In a couple of the studies recently, within the last couple of years that I've supported, the sponsor has done even type C meetings, which are kind of the catch-all type of informal meetings with the FDA team. They've done type C meetings at the time that they're still designing the protocol. Like the protocol is not even done yet, which, in a traditional randomized clinical trial, you wouldn't really necessarily do a lot of that engagement until you have your study design and you're going forward with the study with the FDA. But I think it's helpful because, as we've noted, we're still, as an industry, figuring out how to conduct these studies, how to appropriately qualify the data, how to present that to the stakeholders in a way that they would like to receive it and they can understand it. And therefore, engaging those stakeholders very early in the process is helpful. And the same thing with the statistician, lead statistician. To your point, once we now have determined that the use of the real world data is going to be part of the analytic data set that they're going to be doing analyses on, we definitely have to make sure that we're engaging them, both learning from them from an informatics perspective, like how we need to present the data to them to make it useful, but also to help them understand some of the nuance and kind of messiness that we're dealing with so that they can be aware of that when they do the analysis as well.
So a couple of real life examples. Though the first use case that you talked about, like using data, real world data or patient data sets to understand the impact of trial design and access availability of patients. Awesome use case, some really great partners out there who can help you with that. And some of the most, I would say, decision enabling conversations were when I could show my statistician and clinician, if you have this narrow a value set for this parameter, we lose 70% of patients. If you can broaden it, we may have access to more. We were never going to use the data that we were looking at. It was simply a tool to help us with design and to understand the patient funnel. So perfect. The second part, though, is a little different. And I've used the type C meeting format quite a bit. It was very helpful, especially if we were going to try something innovative for us, because sometimes the regulators had advice. Actually, it went the other way too. Sometimes the regulators had never really thought it through and wanted a partner. So they were very welcoming of those opportunities. The challenge is the Type C meeting doesn't have a time boundary around it. So you
Right.
got to be very early. And I would advocate and maybe even extend Aaron's advice. If you can put it in your clinical development plan, not even your protocol, that's a win. Because then you can be working without the time boundary imposing on your clinical trial design right away.
Great point. Yep, appreciate that. And by the way, to add on to what you just said about the at times the agency themselves hasn't quite thought of it or is learning from us. Also, it's not just us going to them saying, "Here's our approach. Do you agree?" But it's also them saying, "Oh, can you also look at this, or how do we handle this?" And then there's kind of it becomes more of a dialogue than a submission and approval kind of approach. I certainly ran through that in the external control arm example that I had referenced. And when it is a relatively hot topic like external control arms or like EHR enhanced study designs and collecting real-world data or EHR data to support the data collection in a trial, I found them to be quite open and engaging because it's a topic that they also realize they need to figure out, and they're appreciative of that collaboration and back and forth discussion. So they sent us questions, we'd go and kind of research, come back to them with solutions. They'd say, that sounds reasonable to us. Now, at the end of the day, and I'm sure you've run into this as well, they're not going to say, we accept the study before they have the actual data, right? And they're not going to guarantee a lot. They're always cautious. But at least you're getting the guidance and you can course correct early before you go too far down the path and it becomes hard to like go back and redo stuff.
Yeah, it's actually one of the biggest challenges to implement some of these new DCT technologies because you've got your regulatory strategy already set and you don't want to disturb it. So I'm going to park that for a minute because I could talk forever. But it is a great segue into the new FDA guidance on the use of real world data and EMR generated data in regulatory submissions. So I read it, not well, got lost a lot. And as an expert, what do you think is in that guidance that's going to help teams make decisions and drive strategy? And on the opposite pole, what about the guidance do you think makes things hard or maybe raises more questions?
Yeah, that's great. So for everyone's just kind of a little bit of more background to what you just brought up, Jane. As we all know, the FDA issues a number of guidances every year. And in the 21st Century Cures Act from years ago now, they had committed to addressing certain real-world data and real-world evidence type of topics that even were addressed or recommitted to, if you will, in that FDA's framework for real-world evidence program document that came out at the end of 2018. So there are a number of topics here that I think many of us have been on the edge of our seats kind of waiting for that. At the beginning of 2021, so this year, the beginning of the year, the FDA issued a list of the topics or guidances that we expected to see, of which there were 5 on the list that were specifically real-world data, real-world evidence related. The first one was the one you're referring to. So it came out in September of 2021, so just a few months ago, and titled Assessing EHR and Claims Data to Support Regulatory Decision-Making for Drug and Biological Products. For a little more context, there is a separate guidance already. It's been out like few years now around the use of electronic health records and claims data for regulatory decision-making for medical devices. So we've at least had that out a little bit as a potential support, but this is the first time where they've come out and said for drugs and biologics specifically, and it's not even the use of, but it's narrowed to the assessment of. So just to give that context, we're actually still waiting on the guidance that's going to be more around the actual use of how this data will be used within that regulatory decision-making process. So, and by the way, there are 2 other guidances that have come out since then. So in October, there was a guidance around the submission of the of EHR and medical claims or real world data to the FDA. And then just last week, which I haven't read through in detail yet, is a complementary guidance to this one where it's the assessment of patient registry data as real world data source for regulatory decision-making in drugs and biological products. So there's now we have two: assessing EHR medical claims and assessing registry data for the purposes of submitting to the FDA. And we have the guidance that says when we submit the data, what format and technical standards should it comply with. Specific to the one that you're bringing up, which is specifically around EHR medical claims, I would say first off, it's an acknowledgement of the FDA's willingness to accept such data for regulatory decision making. We've kind of known this informally before, but now we have it like in formal guidance that they are willing to consider and accept such data. But it does put a lot of requirements around what they refer to as data relevance and data reliability. So again, for context, data relevance, the FDA defines as, is the data that we're collecting and using relevant, specific to the research questions we're asking? One way you might think of it is, well, this data is not relevant to that, but it's more the other way. And I think this is a little bit more intuitive to all of us. If we have a particular research question, what are all the data variables? What are all the data points that we need to collect in order to answer that question? So that's the relevance part of it. Reliability is more around when we're looking at that data point, does the data mean what we think it means? That's kind of the easiest way that I kind of interpret reliability. There are a bunch more technical components behind it. There's a question in here, even I think around validation of the data. There's internal validation and external validation and completeness, and there's a lot of pieces to that. But at the end of the day, what we're really trying to say is how confident are we that the data means what we think it means? And if it does, then we can now use that data to answer those research questions. And an example I can give in oncology spaces, and in many conditions this is true, when we're talking about progression of disease, we have some pretty specific requirements that qualify, say, prostate cancer, progression of disease in prostate cancer. And we have some definitions that are related to radiographic evidence, medical imaging evidence of progression of disease. In prostate cancer, rising PSA levels as an indicator of progression of disease. We have some definitions there. We might look in health records data and see a clinician interpretation indicating they believe the patient's disease is progressing. But do we know the parameters that they use to make that assessment, and how well can we compare that to our research definitions? We might not always know. And so that's that reliability part. Do we or do we not know exactly what that data point means? And can we, and does it mean what we think it means in terms of answering those research questions? I think that, to me, is both a good and a challenge in this guidance. One, good that they're calling out these issues. Challenge in that there is a lot of requirements in that guidance around documenting how we're assessing relevance and reliability of data for all of the data variables that we might use in a study. And that could be 50, 60 data variables in a given study, and it can be very complex.
Yeah, I got lost in that detail right away. Because I think it also said, okay, you might have a set of parameters that help support your research question, like you said, then you have to prove the relevance, reliability, and then you have to show traceability and sort of what I would call the audit trail of how you generated the data, where it went, how it was transformed or not. Yep. So it's recreating those randomized clinical trial requirements, but from real world data in a way.
Yeah, so I think that's the more condensed, maybe simplest way to think about it. If we take it kind of one level above that, and I'll come back to that point that you just made, but there are a lot of technical pieces that go into it when we roll it up using the FDA's kind of definition and framework. It's relevant to the questions we're trying to answer. It's reliable from a data accrual perspective. So at the time in which we collect, or when the data is collected, is it reliable? And then to your point about auditing trails and traceability, everything we do with the data to ultimately turn it into our analytic data set and conduct the analyses and generate results, clearly understanding, documenting all that we did such that we can maintain that reliability over that. We don't accidentally lose reliability because some of those activities we did to the data. So those all pieces, and to your point, at the end of the day, we could take this guidance and then the guidance that came out in October around the submission of the data. And at the end of the day, the FDA is saying, we expect you to take real world data and present it to us in a way that is as close to clinical trial data as possible. I think where we get into some of the challenges, and there are a number of entities that I know, including some professional societies and some biopharma companies who have submitted responses to the FDA. What gets challenging is how close is close enough, right? And because we're not going to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect ever. And so where is the close enough piece? And that's not, clearly defined. And it's probably really hard to define that, but, how close is close enough? So.
Well, that's why we have whole real world data groups now who can probably help with that. But I think it's also, I don't know about this, it's a supposition. It's going to be a big shift in mindset for sponsors, let alone regulators, to get more comfortable with the fact that some of this data is not going to look the same and some of it's going to be missing, and we're not going to query it. And that's a big shift from the old way of doing things. But it's
thought on that, good. Jane, is I think that's also where when we think about the EHR enhanced study designs, we'll put external control arms aside because that's even more complex. But if we're running a randomized clinical trial, interventional randomized clinical trial, and whether we're using decentralized methods or site-based methods, if we want to supplement some of the data collection, part of that decision around which data we collect from real-world data on behalf of those patients and which data we collect in a traditional direct way from the patients and maybe through their providers is going to be that. If we can't have high reliability in a particular data point, we're going to then have to choose to collect it directly and not rely on the real world data. If we have higher reliability and confidence in real world data, then we can collect it there. And so that every study, we're going to be balancing that equation and saying, okay, how confident are we in this data point, this data point? So one of the areas that I've seen it most often used recently is for monitoring large or impactful safety events that might occur between visits. If we're looking for things like death or hospitalization or significant acute medical conditions that may be a safety signal, monitoring real world data to look for those events between patient visits is one way in which we can do EHR enhanced studies. And we're using that to trigger these major events that we're confident are going to be collected in their records. If they get hospitalized or if they have a GI perforation or some major anaphylactic reaction, we're more confident that that's going to get documented and we'll be able to see it. And then on the next visit, we might have some things in there to ask or verify or collect more data around that.
That makes sense. I'm going to ask you a question about this later, but I also want to leave time for other people to ask questions, and I want to hear what are your lessons learned. Like, you've given us a few examples on trying to go execute these things. What worked really well? What was harder than you expected? And what would you advise us to think about as we start on this journey?
Yeah, great question. So I think that at the end of the day, I think it's easy sometimes to adjust our expectations based on what we think is or isn't available in real world data. And what I would caution is that the kind of real world data sources that are becoming more and more available to us are constantly advancing. So my advice, number one, would be always start with your underlying purpose in mind and define your research needs independent of the data sources. Don't let any of our impression of the data influence our study, our research questions, right? Like, we should have clear questions. We need to answer these questions. We need to generate this evidence, regardless of where the data is coming from. And then we use that purpose to drive our decisions around which data are appropriate fit. So then that's the second point that I would leave is how important qualifying and assessing data is becoming much more than it used to be. 10 years ago, we would send some requests off to the handful of rural data vendors out there, and we would say, how many patients do you have with this medical condition treated with this drug? And hey, do you capture these data variables? And it'd be kind of relatively that simple. And yet I think today, because of these requirements and our advancements in the complexity of use cases we're leveraging these data for, we need to be more diligent about how we assess and qualify those data sources, especially when we intend to submit it to the FDA. They will require us to document that. And my third point, final point, would be document. So purpose, right, drives our data needs, diligence and qualification of the data we're using, and document everything, because we're going to be having to justify that to a number of stakeholders that in the past we really hadn't dealt with before.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually it aligns a little bit to DIME, the Digital Medicine Society. First principle, always know what it is you need to collect to answer the science. Then think about the collection methodology.
Yes.
And I've seen too often that people get fixated on a device or a data set. And to your point, that can really limit or steer you in the wrong direction of what you could collect and where from.
I'll give a quick example in COVID, because we're seeing this a lot right now. How do we define severe COVID? And there are a number of definitions out there. Even the WHO's definition is slightly different than the CDC's definition, et cetera. But more importantly, when we're doing our clinical trials, what is our definition? And then when we're doing our real world effectiveness research afterwards, what is our definition? And I've seen often in the trials, they're pretty well defined. Things like hypoxemia, plus hospitalization and oxygenation use. There are a number of parameters that would qualify for severe COVID. But then in real world research, it's like we often will, without even thinking about it, we just kind of default to, I probably won't find that data, so let's just look at any hospitalization as severe. And I would say, well, let's start off with, well, what is the ideal? Like if our research question is severe, and if we're doing real world effectiveness research with the intent to somehow validate or compare to our trials, we should adopt our trial definitions and then go out and see if we can find data that can fill that. If we can't, then we might have to adjust our definition a little bit, but at least now we know why we adjusted the definition and what the impact of that adjustment was, as opposed to just kind of doing a knee-jerk reaction. And then we don't necessarily know the impact of that decision.
Back on mute. We have about 7 minutes left, and I want to encourage people to keep asking questions. I think we have addressed, or at least tried to touch on, I don't know that we provided answers for every single question that was raised, but at least we touched on them. So if you have some, please put them in the chat or find another way to signal us. I have one of those questions. So one of the reasons we want to do this is to decrease patient burden and maybe make data useful across multiple settings. Could be in a trial, could be in multiple trials, could be in a patient registry. So I'm thinking back as an old school operator, I did dozens of oncology trials, right? Dozens. And many of these patients are very, very sick. And I remember too many times telling the physician who was an investigator, no, we're going to have to repeat that test, even though you just did it within the last 3 weeks, because you didn't do it in the frame of a clinical trial. So that's sort of the background. But do you think that these approaches can help us limit those retests? Or what do we need to think of to make that a possibility?
Interesting. So you certainly understand that space better than I do. Are you referring to like pre-tests, like as in the pre-screening process?
Yeah, like usually it wasn't another tumor assessment or biopsy, thank goodness, but sometimes sometimes it was pretty invasive.
Yeah, that's a great question. If one of the biggest underlying limitations that we have with real world data is that it represents, well, again, at the core, it represents what happened to a patient in a healthcare, in their healthcare setting, generally speaking. But it also means that it's limited to what standard of care. And so if those measures that we're referring to weren't done as part of a standard of care of a patient, then yeah, it wouldn't be there. If it was, then yes, it might help narrow that down. And certainly with some of those measures, I mean, even if we think of oncology and, well, like let's say baseline ECOG score, that's done a lot in oncology. We might need to do that again at the first visit in the trial to create that baseline, but we might have an inclusion criteria saying, well, we really want to limit to people who already have an ECOG score of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 or whatever it is. So we could use, I think even today, we could use some real world data sources to help narrow that potential pool down to the patients most likely eligible for the study. But unfortunately, ECOG score isn't captured on every patient in these healthcare, or at least not well documented in all of the real world data sources. And so we would have to say, if I see it, then I'm confident the patient has that data point and might be eligible. But if I don't see it, I wouldn't necessarily exclude them from the screening process because they might still be very eligible and we just simply don't have the data.
So another example might be HER2 tumor status, right?
Yeah.
And yes, it's a commercially available test. And I've actually had patients repeat that test through their physicians, not from an at-home testing toolkit, because the validation parameters of the tests had to be so consistent within the trial. So I think that just points out, even when it is part of clinical care, the trial may have different standards or may want to decrease the variability across the data set, especially for an inclusion criteria parameter. But I think the more we can challenge ourselves to think, well, what could we use? Like you said, like, okay, there was an ECOG assessment done. Okay, there was a CBC done, and it was a week ago. Do we really need to repeat that as part of the screening process? That's where I see real world data potentially decreasing burden on the patient side.
Yeah, to use a kind of comparison between clinical trial data and real world data a little bit here. When we have specific data questions in our ECRFs that we ask in our clinical trials, we get answers for everything effectively or mostly everything we ask. And we'll get explicit evidences of yes or no, right? Something exists or didn't exist or whatever. But in real world data, we often get only the yeses, and then we have kind of missing. And depending on what it is, if it's missing, we can sometimes reliably assume that the patient doesn't have it. So if we don't see a diagnosis for pancreatic cancer in someone's records, we kind of assume that they don't have pancreatic cancer. But the reality is when they're missing information, it's either evidence that the patient doesn't have it, so negative evidence, if you will, or negative evidence, or it's just simply not documented, but it was documented somewhere else. The patient might still have it and we just simply don't know. And that's some issue that we do have to deal with in real world data. And so again, back to the point around what we use the data for, if we're collecting the data to submit it to the FDA, we've got to be really confident that we're collecting and understanding all the data we're seeing, both the data there, but also the data that's not there. And that that if it's not there, then we are correctly assuming the patient doesn't have that condition or that outcome. But also in recruitment strategies or clinical trial operation activities for screening purposes, we can adjust that as well. So we could say, even though we don't see an ECOG score or we don't see a HER2 test done, we might still include them in our screening to say, hey, we'll lower prioritize them, but let's still screen them. Or we might choose to limit ourselves and say, hey, look, there's so many patients that we could choose from here. Let's go ahead and limit it only to those that have a data point, and kind of adjust that rigor that I was mentioning earlier.
Well, you got me all curious now about other regulators around the world, but that might be a follow-on conversation because we're
Absolutely.
at time. Thank you so much for your time, Aaron, and for your expertise. And thank you to the participants for your questions. I think on the next slide, you can see how to reach me if you have questions. I'm on LinkedIn. Aaron is too. And we welcome them because I'm definitely in learning mode and I'm relying on people like Aaron to guide me as I'm trying to think, how do we decrease burden for patients and for sites using what is already available? So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care, everyone.